وسهلا بكل الذين ينضموا للاستماع إلى راديو بلدي، أول راديو عربي أمريكي ويعنى بقضايا العرب في المهجر. برامجنا في راديو بلدي كل يوم جمعة من 8 وحتى 9 صباحا مع ليلى الحسيني في بث حي ومباشر عبر WNZK راديو 690 AM. صباح الخير بلدي، صباح الخير لكل مستمعينا.
Welcome to Radio Baladi, the first Arab, Middle Eastern, and American simulcast radio show. Radio Baladi is broadcast every Friday morning on WNZK 690 AM from 8 until 9 Eastern Time on Good Morning Michigan with Layla Al-Husseini. Our call-in number 248-557-3300. And now, stay tuned for the best radio talk show on Arab and American issues with your host, Layla Al-Husseini.
I am Atif Abdel Jawad. Join me the first Friday of each month at 8 a.m. Eastern Time. I will be discussing some of the most important issues and events in the Middle East live on America's Voice of the Arabs. WNZK 690 AM and WDMV 700 AM.
Life is a nonprofit charity that's provided humanitarian aid and development to people and communities for over 25 years, regardless of race, color, religion, or cultural background. When disaster occurs here or around the world, Life for Relief and Development rushes in to provide food, medical aid, and shelter to those in need. Please help improve these efforts. Make your tax-deductible donation to Life now at lifeusa.org or call 248-424-7493.
Kashat's Mediterranean Market in Shish Kebab offers a great array of your favorite Mediterranean meals. Meals range from lamb specialties, shawarma sandwiches, seafood dinners, and they offer special big trays of your favorite food, plus much more. Kashat's Mediterranean Market in Shish Kebab address is 32839 Northwestern Highway in Farmington Hills. Their phone number is 248-538-9552. That number again is 248-538-9552. And the supermarket is open from 8 a.m. to 9 p.m. Kashat's Mediterranean Market and Shish Kebab will definitely leave you satisfied.
When it comes to reproductive medicine, IVF Michigan Fertility Centers are the recognized leaders. With locations in Bloomfield Hills and 5 other cities in Michigan and Ohio, IVF has experts in all aspects of the field. As a founding member of IVF Michigan Fertility Centers, Dr. Nicholas Shama is one of the leading reproductive endocrinologists in Michigan and Ohio. Dr. Shama has performed over 10,000 IVF cases and has helped thousands of couples fulfill their dreams of parenthood. American board certified in both obstetrics and gynecology and reproductive endocrinology and infertility, Dr. Nicholas Shama is a very caring, compassionate, expert physician that understands not only the medical but also the emotional toil of infertility on his patients. When it's time, get personalized care from Dr. Nicholas Shama at IVF Michigan Fertility Centers in Michigan and Ohio. Call toll-free 855-952-9600, 855-952-9600.
When you're looking for the best in optical care, Dr. Imad Nakash is your doctor to see. With years of experience and thousands of successful procedures performed, you can trust your eyes to Dr. Imad Nakash. See Dr. Imad Nakash and his professional staff for your eye care needs. There's 2 locations to serve you. In Hazel Park, call 248-336-3937. 248-336-3937. In Rochester Hills, call 248-299-3937. That's 248-299-3937.
I am Atif Abdel Jawad. Join me the first Friday of each month at 8 a.m. Eastern Time. I will be discussing some of the most important issues and events in the Middle East live on America's Voice of the Arabs. WNZK 690 AM and WDMV 700 AM.
Good morning. A Saudi newspaper says a Biden presidency would be worse to Saudi Arabia than COVID-19. Yet the Saudi Crown Prince rushed to congratulate President-elect Joe Biden of winning the U.S. presidential election within 24 hours and before the results were certified. The Egyptian president was even faster. Both leaders were some of the closest allies of President Donald Trump. Mr. Biden is on record criticizing Saudi domestic and foreign policies and pointing out Egypt's dismal human rights record. He plans to rejoin the Iran nuclear deal and review America's relationship with what he called dictators around the world. So what impact will the Biden presidency have on U.S.-Arab relations, and why Arab allies of Trump are rushing to be friendly with Joe Biden? To discuss these and other questions, we have a group of distinguished guests and experts who will explore with us in the next hour the possible scenarios for the U.S.-Arab relations under President Biden. We have with us from the Netherlands the Honorable Edward Abington, former Consul General in Jerusalem from 93 to 97. We have with us Professor David DeRoche, who is Associate Professor at the Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Studies at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. We also have with us Professor Paulo von Schirach, who is president of the Global Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. My first question is for all our three guests, and let's start with Ambassador Abington. Ambassador, do you agree with the Saudi newspaper, and why?
I think that the newspaper is a little too pessimistic about what U.S.-Saudi relations will be under President Biden. There's no doubt that there's going to be some serious changes from the relationship under Trump, but one has to keep in mind that the U.S. has had a strong relationship with Saudi Arabia for 75 or 80 years, and there will be adjustments, but the relationship will continue. I think Biden will de-emphasize the war in Yemen. Human rights will become more important, and climate change, as he stated, is going to be a priority of his administration. But nevertheless, I think that Saudi-U.S. relations will continue going forward.
Okay, thank you. Professor DeRoche. Same question.
Yeah, I agree with the ambassador. The quotes are lurid, as is often the case in Saudi newspapers. The bottom line is Saudi Arabia is an important country for the United States. The United States is an important country for Saudi Arabia. It doesn't really matter who the president is. The policies are remarkably the same. We have shared interests. There may be some friction along the margins, but to expect a fundamental shift or realignment is to misunderstand the nature of international politics.
Professor Schirach.
Well, thank you. I agree with the previous speakers. Certainly this is a long and enduring and very strong relationship that is not going to be transformed radically because there is a new president in Washington, D.C. That said, let's not forget that a great deal of the new emphasis and closeness between President Trump and his administration and the Gulf monarchies was in large measure predicated on having identified Iran as the common enemy. And that created, if you wish, a stronger bond in terms of unity of purpose of saying we are all united here on this common front against Iran, to the extent that the Biden administration will try in some fashion to rekindle the old so-called nuclear deal with Iran in some fashion. It's probably not going to be the same for sure. Well, then maybe the emphasis on this common front may be diminished. But that does not mean, that there will be radical transformations in the U.S.-Saudi relationship.
going back to Ambassador Abington, what is the biggest change we can expect to see in the Middle East during the Biden presidency?
Well, I would say for one thing, the Middle East is going to be a lesser priority probably for Biden than it was for Trump, or for that matter, under President Obama. But the last speaker, I think, made a very important point that President-elect Biden will try to regenerate with Iran the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action to put limits on Iran's nuclear program. Biden had an interview with Tom Friedman in the New York Times several days ago. And Biden made very clear that this is a very high priority for him. And he said the last thing the United States wanted to see would be nuclear competition in the region, with Iran gaining nuclear weapons, perhaps leading them to the Saudis, the Turks, the Egyptians, or others also trying to gain nuclear capability. And he termed that a real danger in terms of U.S. security. So he's going to put a lot of emphasis on this, I believe, and that inevitably is going to lead to some frictions with the Gulf states, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, but also real frictions, I suspect, with Israel.
Ambassador Dirash, yesterday or this morning, because of the time difference, the Iranian foreign minister said no, but thank you, no, to Joe Biden's idea of coming back to the deal. So what do you expect will happen then?
Look, I think as anyone who's practiced diplomacy knows, people put ideas on the table and stake out positions, which over the course of negotiations they modify. Biden is bringing people into his administration that help negotiate and bring about the deal with Iran. And the other parties, the Europeans, the Russians, they want to see this deal go forward. The Iranians are known to be tough negotiators. And I think that the foreign minister is probably staking out a position. But once contacts actually start with the new administration, my guess is that certainly the United States and the Iranians will see benefits to moving forward to a more stable U.S.-Iranian relationship, and hopefully to for the U.S. to rejoin the JCPOA.
Professor Dirash, now, how would Mr. Biden react if, obviously, as the ambassador just said, Saudi Arabia doesn't like the idea of a better relationship between the U.S. and Iran? So how would Mr. Biden strike a balance between his desire to improve relations with Iran, but at the same time, he faces the anger of Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, so this is going to be a great challenge for the incoming Biden administration. I mean, whenever you're leading a coalition, you always have interests that are diverse, and this is going to be a real problem because the Saudis do not see accommodation with Iran as in their national interests. They want Iran confronted and defeated, and they think it is within the ability of the United States to do it almost, with just the flick of a switch. So, they're going to have to be accommodated in some way. What makes it complicated for Biden is that within his party and within his own administration, there are people who have called for sanctions on Saudi Arabia because of the Jamal Khashoggi murder, because of the conduct of the war in Yemen, and because of the general poor human rights situation in Saudi Arabia. So this is going to be a very, very fine wire that Biden has to walk on. He has people that he is going to have to rely on who want to see Saudi Arabia punished, and he's going to have to give Saudi Arabia incentives to get them to go along with any Iran deal, even if he can get Iran to agree with it.
Professor Chirac, let's say Mr. Biden and Iran strike a deal. Does that mean in your opinion, that other crises in the region, like Syria, the war in Yemen, wherever Iran is involved, those crises will be easier to resolve?
Well, it's hard to say, really. First of all, what kind of a deal? You know, an ideal deal should be that there is an unquestionable guarantee that Iran will not be in a position to develop nuclear weapons. There was, of course, doubt that the old deal, the one that was negotiated by the Obama administration with John Kerry as Secretary of State and in the lead in this whole process when Joe Biden was vice president, that was questionable whether it achieved that or simply put kind of a freeze on the existing nuclear program in Iran that could be resumed at a later date. So we'll have to see what kind of a new deal can be achieved. If that fundamental strategic American objective, which is shared, by the way, by the Saudis and Israel and others, that there is unquestionably a freeze, not just a freeze, but a halt, a termination of any possibility that Iran now or at a later date will develop a nuclear weapon, well, that would be a great achievement. I am not sure whether this is possible or not. Having said that, as we know, in the past, the Obama administration did not want to link the nuclear deal with other issues that we're all very familiar with in terms of Iranian malfeasance in the region, from Lebanon to Syria to Yemen to indeed Iraq. How is that going to be managed, diplomatically in the bilateral relationship, negotiations between the United States and Tehran? We'll have to see. It's really, really too early to say. But certainly, there will be pressure on the Biden administration to see to it that whatever negotiation focusing on the nuclear deal are, struck in the end, that all these other issues somehow are also involved. This would be extremely difficult given the Iranian reluctance to accept any of this, and we've seen this consistently throughout the years. So it's not really easy to say what is achievable at this point. I would not put too much hope on a new, productive restraint on Iranian policies in the region. That restraint may be a function of lack of money, and that is sanctions. So, but the whole issue of sanctions and a deal, as we know, are interconnected. So the Iranians will never accept a deal without the removal of sanctions. So, in other words, this is quite complicated.
Ambassador Abington, now let's think for a second about Israel's reaction. Israel wouldn't be happy either. So what do you think Israel could do, or how they would react if there was a deal between Mr. Biden and Iran?
Well, if we look back at the Obama administration, I think President Obama basically felt that Israel could not really be a partner in this. And as time went on, Netanyahu increasingly played an obstructionist role, delivering a speech before Congress, which was really a challenge to President Obama. I think that, we're likely to see Israeli elections next March. Netanyahu seems to manage his political difficulties reasonably well, so we can't rule out that he will be prime minister again. But fundamentally, the Israelis have to have a good relationship with the United States. There will be difficulties with Israel over resumption of negotiations with Iran, and if some kind of a deal is reached, the Israelis will not like it. They probably will try to play up their animosity with Republicans in the Congress. But the bottom line is that for Israel, the relationship with the U.S. is absolutely critical, and they will not, I think, take actions to jeopardize that.
Ambassador Derash, some people say you can't have a good human rights record and an effective war on terrorism at the same time. Most of those people are in the Middle East, but also here, as President Trump normally prefers a fight against terrorism, even though human rights are violated.
Well,
Yeah, I've
you're
heard
right.
that.
You're right that there is some tension between pursuing human rights and dealing with the threat of terrorism. I think that we have let the threat of terrorism dominate too much our foreign policy agenda, especially in the Middle East. And I think that we need to recalibrate and see and bring it more into balance with the reality on the ground there. One can even argue that U.S. policy has only exacerbated the threat of terrorism in the region. So I think that's something that needs to be seriously looked at. On the other hand, the Trump administration has paid virtually no attention to human rights. Certainly not as it applies to Egypt or Saudi Arabia, or for that matter, how the Israelis treat the Palestinians. And I think that there will be pressure on Biden, and I think a willingness on Biden, on the part of Biden, to place more emphasis on human rights and to have a very serious and meaningful dialogue with countries that he sees as undermining universal human rights.
Professor Derosh, the same question for you. How do we balance human rights and the fight against terrorism?
Well, it's a good question. So most of our partners in the Middle East recognize human rights, but don't really enforce it, and basically think that the war on terrorism allows them to just operate unconstrained by considerations of human rights. And to be honest, I agree with Ambassador Abingdon. The Trump administration has not done much to disabuse them of this notion. I think it requires, I think that hectoring them, lecturing them on human rights is not that effective, and sanctions, as have been proposed by some in Biden's party, are also of limited effectiveness, although individual sanctions against human rights violators may be helpful. I think what we have to do is bring them around to a view that if you are conducting a war against what is really a domestic insurgency, and you're violating everybody's rights, you're not solving the problem, you're actually creating more sympathizers. I think you have to approach it as a tactical thing and bring them around to a view of effective governance, not just knocking heads in the interest of national security. And I think that Biden's folks will push for a view towards that, and I think that the United States will have to emphasize it more. But I don't think it will be visible, because raising those issues visibly is counterproductive. And I don't think that the people on the Democratic Party or people who view human rights as a primary concern in foreign policy will be happy with what they see out of a Biden administration.
Professor Chirac, do you agree? I mean, do you think Mr. Biden will turn a blind eye to violations of human rights in Saudi Arabia and Egypt and elsewhere, as long as the fight against terrorism is going on?
Well, look, this is, again, as the other speakers have noted, and I agree, this is kind of a fine line. And it's always been a tension in American foreign policy, whether we are about, practical national interest and realism, or whether we are out there to uphold lofty, principles. And there's always been this tension in U.S. foreign policy. How the Biden administration, which will be populated by sort of, let's say, old-fashioned in terms, not because they're old, but because of their beliefs, international, liberal internationalists. So this seems to be the types of people who will be at the State Department and the National Security Council staff, at the UN, etc. So basically upholding principles. And of course, human rights and the upholding of human rights is an American kind of staple point in throughout U.S. foreign policy, over the decades. So if we focus on the region, on the Middle East, how do you balance the two? I suspect it will be a kind of a mixed bag, but done probably more in private than in public. There is no interest in creating a row with whether it's with Saudi Arabia, Egypt, or other countries, and call them to task. Say, hey, you're not doing this, you're not doing that. Shame on you, and indeed maybe follow up with sanctions as was proposed in the U.S. Congress because of Saudi behavior on this and that. I don't think that it will be wise for a Biden administration to take a righteous strident tone. Having said all that, let's also look at this in the broader perspective. My contention is that the Middle East is not as significant as a foreign policy priority now, regardless, quite frankly, as to who is in the White House, because the absolutely overriding American national security concerns will be elsewhere, and that is China. That is going to be the number one, and I suggest number two and number three priority of a Biden administration. That said, the Middle East remains important, and what we discussed about, proliferation issues and Iran and all that, that remains a hot issue on the table, but not as significant as it would have been, say, 10 or 15 years ago.
Yes, we will discuss China and other priorities of Mr. Biden's later on in the program. We are going to take a short break now. When we come back from the break, I'm going to ask Ambassador Abington about the expected first foreign trip that Mr. Biden might take. We remember Mr. Trump visited Saudi Arabia, and whether or not Mr. Biden will go to the Middle East or somewhere else, that will also indicate to us his priorities. When we get back after the break.
Are you going to start a restaurant or grocery store soon? Do you need floor plans and designs? Call Naji Abood at 734-744-9796. Do you want to buy kitchen and restaurant equipment at discount prices? Call Naji Abood now, 734-744-9796. New Concept Products and Design, the trademark of kitchen equipment. 5% discount on all purchases of $75,000 or more. New Concept Products and Design, new location, 31185 Schoolcraft in Livonia. Learn more at www.newconceptproducts.com. Call Naji Abood, 734-744-9796.
Enjoy the first Syrian-style cuisine in Michigan. At Damas Cuisine and Catering, you'll find a wide selection of Syrian foods and sweets in our menu, like frikeh, hoizi, grape leaves with steak, mashawi platter, hot mahashi, char-grilled kebab, shawarma, and much more. Get super fast delivery from Damas Cuisine and Catering right to your door. Order online at damascuisine.com/menu and track your order live. Damas Cuisine and Catering, 28841 Orchard Lake Road in Farmington Hills. Call 248-987-4985.
I am Atif Abdel Jawad. Join me the first Friday of each month at 8 a.m. Eastern Time. I will be discussing some of the most important issues and events in the Middle East live on America's Voice of the Arabs. WNZK 690 AM and WDMV 700 AM.
Welcome back to our discussion on Radio Baladi. We are discussing Mr. Biden's expected policies in the Middle East and his relationship with Arab countries. Ambassador Abington, as we know, Mr. Trump's first foreign trip was to Saudi Arabia. Where should Mr. Biden go first and why?
Well, I don't think that it's going to be to Saudi Arabia, for that matter, anywhere in the Middle East. My guess is that President Biden will first look to Europe in terms of repairing our relationships with the Europeans, with NATO's, and so forth. China is a top priority as well.
Okay, Ambassador. Yes, go ahead.
And of course, any type of trip like this needs to have preparation and diplomatic discussions so that it's not just tourism, but something substantive comes out of it. But I would expect that when he becomes president, Biden will probably look first to Europe.
Professor DeRoche, do you agree?
I agree. I think the COVID may throw a wrench in the plans, but I think I would bet money he will go to Brussels with a stop in Great Britain, either to or fro, and that's partially for policy reasons and partially just to underline the difference between him and Donald Trump.
Professor Chirac.
I certainly would agree. I think that if we look at America's foreign policy priorities going forward, it will be to reconstitute and rekindle relations with our traditional allies. And Europe is certainly, on top of the list. Of course, you can add in the Indo-Pacific. You could add Japan. I would think that would not be a surprise to me. If that would be a priority. I'm not sure if it comes before or after Europe, but I think will be very, very high on the list. And again, reconnecting to what we were saying earlier, maybe there's time to discuss it later. If we want to have a comprehensive policy in confronting the global challenges represented by China, we need friends and allies. And that Mr. Biden has already said publicly, and some of his people who are going to be at the top of foreign policy, making positions in his administration, has said this much. If we want to do this, we have to have friends, and Europe is our friend, and therefore we have to rekindle the relationship both at the economic level with the European Union and, of course, at the national security and strategic level with NATO.
Ambassador Abington, you were involved for many years in negotiations, peace negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians. Mr. Biden is not expected to reverse decisions taken by President Trump when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian dispute. But what will be the headlines of Mr. Biden's policies when dealing with that dispute?
Well, I think that there will definitely be adjustments to the issue, and particularly when it comes to the Palestinians. There are some things I think Biden won't do. For example, I do not believe that he would reverse Trump's decision to move the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. That would just create too many domestic problems for Biden. He's not going to do it. But there are other things that he can do. He can tell the PLO that they're welcome to reopen an office in Washington, D.C., which Trump had closed. He can resume American assistance to UNRWA and to the Palestinian Authority for educational and economic programs, and I expect he will do that. He, I believe, will continue giving security assistance to the Palestinian Authority on the assumption that the Palestinian Authority resumes security coordination with Israel. And I think at some level, there will be an interest in seeing if there's a possibility to resume a dialogue on looking ahead towards resumption of negotiations. But it certainly is not going to be a top priority of the administration, and I think that lower level officials in the administration will be dealing with it, not the Secretary of State, nor do I expect that President Biden himself will become deeply involved in the issue. There are simply too many other critically important issues, internationally and domestically, that are going to really be at the top of his agenda.
Professor Dorosh, apart from the steps, small steps that Ambassador Abington talked about, Mr. Biden will be too busy with other bigger problems. He has other priorities, and he will probably not pay much attention to the Israeli-Palestinian dispute unless some people say, unless the Palestinians submit a major initiative that is different from everything that has ever been there. What do you think the Palestinians should do to grab Mr. Biden's attention?
Well, that's a good question. Look, Biden is going to have, he is not going to have a whole lot of tools. And he's dealing with an American public that, quite frankly, is tired of this issue. The narrative that I think there is a ingrained sympathy for the Palestinians, but I think that it doesn't translate into the policy realm. And when you look at, the narrative of corruption in the Palestinian Authority and the fact that the leadership there is not exactly democratic, that resonates. And Biden's going to be dealing with a razor-thin margin in the House of Representatives. He's probably going to be dealing with a hostile Senate. He's not going to have a lot of tools. So the same old things that the Palestinians have been doing is not going to work. They are going to have to come up with a game changer. And understand that even under the best of circumstances, there's not going to be money the way there was in the Trump administration. Already deficit hawks are swirling. So even if they show the most competent leadership and real visionary policy proposals, the Palestinians are still going to find that the United States just doesn't have as big a toolbox as it might have had 4 years ago. It's going to be hard. I would not take that job on for all the money in the world. But they can't keep doing what they were doing. And, that's not going to get anywhere. I think there will probably be some change in the Israeli government. But again, fundamentally, unless they reform the narrative, they're not going to get anywhere. The main difference we'll see from Biden will be one of tone and improvements on the margins.
Professor Chirac, what do you think the Trump deal of the century, so-called deal of the century, will ultimately go after Mr. Trump is out of office? Will it survive?
No, it will not. However, the Trump administration has done a couple of things that are really important to point to. And again, probably we knew this already, but now it's demonstrably so. The fact that Israel has now officially diplomatic relations with the Emirates and with Bahrain and now Sudan as well demonstrates one thing, that the Palestinian issue is no longer the fundamental matter that needs to be resolved before anything else can be discussed. There was a time in which that was it. In any discussion, in any negotiations regarding the Middle East and potentially, the normalization of relations with Israel, the Arabs would say, well, first let's take care of the Palestinian issue, because unless that is taken care of, nothing can be discussed. Well, that's no longer true, right? This is no longer true. The Palestinian issue has been downgraded, not in Washington, but in the Arab world. That's a reality that the Palestinians should take a close look at. And as dismayed as they are seeing Israel normalizing relations with fellow Arabs, they have to take notice of this. And so if we consider this as a contextual transformation, which I think is quite radical, then the Biden administration attitude or possible I don't know efforts to deal with the Palestinian-Israeli issue will follow that. Meaning, this is no longer that important. and therefore it's not a priority. And I fully agree with the other speakers who said this is not going to be another Biden plan for Palestine, another roadmap, there will be a high-level, super negotiator who will be in charge. No, it will not be handled that way because it's not a priority. And sad as it is for the Palestinians who will see probably their dream of statehood, full statehood, pushed into, quite frankly, Neverland. As tough as that is, this is a reality on the ground. What Trump has done vis-a-vis Israel will not be reversed. The embassy is not going to be removed. The issue of the settlements, which has been so contentious during the Obama administration, probably will be not paid. They will not pay too much attention to, and people are not going to be so exercised if there's another announcement in Jerusalem saying, "Oh, another settlement will get started here and there." This will, unfortunately, and I say for the Palestinians, this will continue, and the Palestinians will have to make the best of this rather unfavorable environment. And I don't see the Biden administration coming to the rescue in any significant way.
We have Mr. Khalil Hashim on the telephone line with a question. Let's see what he has. Go ahead, Mr. Hashim.
Good morning, and thank you, Dr. Jawad. This is a great discussion, a great panel, and I want to thank all the panelists for their views. Very quickly, most of them are accurate. The only game changer is a return to the status quo prior to the Trump era, and that's what Israel really wants. And blaming the lack of progress on the Palestinians is really, there's nothing they can do. Mr. Netanyahu has shifted the conflict from Arab-Israeli conflict to Israeli-Iranian conflict, recruiting most of the Sunni Arab countries in that conflict. It might not be a priority, but the Palestinian questions will continue to be the heart of the conflict in the Middle East. And the other point is, as long as Israel has unchecked nuclear weapons, about 200 nukes, the nuclear race in the Middle East is on and already has started. To say that only Iran with nuclear nukes would start the race, that's not really accurate. And as far as, the human rights, this is a stick that we use only when it's convenient, because we like to deal with dictators, with families, whatever it is. And when they don't follow our policies, then we raise the human rights stick, but we don't raise it here, we don't raise it there. Would President Biden ask Israel to reconsider its annexation of the Golan Heights, which is against international law? I don't think so. Or attacking Syrian territories on a daily basis, or violating Lebanon's sky and land and sea. I don't think so. If we don't see a change in the Israeli behavior, I really don't think there's going to be any change in the Middle East. And I don't see Biden going after that at all. And just like to see what your panels would think of that.
Okay, Ambassador Abington.
Well, I have to say I agree with much of what Professor Chirac said. I think the Palestinians, you earlier said, well, should they present some far-reaching new initiative? This ground has been plowed so many times by so many people. I don't think there is such a thing as a new initiative. Israel has increasingly moved to the right, and Netanyahu, who I've known since 1983 when he was in Washington, he has no interest in serious negotiations to bring about a two-state solution. So basically, the Palestinians are out of options. And I agree fully that the formal establishment of relationship with several Arab countries changes the dynamics. The Palestinians are well aware that they are really out of options and that their toolbox is pretty empty. And as someone who's worked on this issue for 40 years or so, I find it really heartbreaking that we are in the situation that we're in. But now, it seems to me that instead of a diplomatic initiative to deal with this, increasingly this is going to become an issue that Israeli Jews, Israeli Arabs, and Palestinians are going to have to work out. And already attitudes among Palestinians towards a one-state solution is moving in that direction. That doesn't mean that Israeli Jews are going to accept that, but it seems to me that the prospect of a diplomatic solution to this complex problem is just about over.
Professor DeRoche, what do you think about that?
Well, it's a fascinating issue. I've heard the arguments the callers made, and I generally don't work on Israel-Palestine issue, and I certainly don't have the same level of depth that Ambassador Abian has. But let me make a couple points. First off, the demography is working against the hardline Israeli position, and Israel is being pushed. They were able to hold off the demographic reckoning by large-scale immigration of Jewish people from the former Soviet Union, but that's pretty much over. And what we're seeing now is that Israel is facing a point at which they may become the argument that they are an apartheid state will have more legitimacy if you actually do have a majority of Palestinians within the 1948 or the 1967 borders of Israel. So that works against them, and that undercuts their support internationally. The second point I'd point out is that we've heard for years from people both friendly and hostile to the interests of the United States that the unresolved Palestinian issue is the source of all evil, and it may be the source of all evil originally. I don't necessarily agree with that argument, but a lot of the factors that are brought in now, quite frankly, have changed. So, Lebanon is not a sovereign state. The presence of Hezbollah there is fine. I think that most Americans are happy with Israel conducting combat operations in Lebanon and will be until, Lebanon becomes a legitimate state. The Israeli nuclear program is often raised. That's fine, but a nuclear program without missiles to deliver it is kind of it's an issue of concern, but it's not as practical. So these things are not exactly equivalent. But at the end of the day, the real change has to happen on the Israeli side, and I think the demography is what's going to make that happen.
Well, we'll take a short break. When we come back, I will ask Professor Chirac whether the Biden presidency is or will be a third Obama term. When we come back.
Ziyad brand. Quality products from our family to yours. Ziyad Brothers Importing offers the finest quality products, including brands like Sultan, Kraft, Nestle, Hook, Rico Picon, Donna, and many more. Ask your retailer to carry these fine products because you deserve the very best. For more information, visit our website at www.ziyad.com. That's www.ziyad.com. Ziyad, quality products from our family to yours.
At Top Rehab Physical Therapy Clinic in Dearborn, we provide effective physical therapy sessions in order to limit pain and discomfort. Top Rehab provides physical therapy care for any diagnosis prescribed by a physician, and we regularly see and treat conditions such as stroke, TMJ, fibromyalgia, sciatica, joint pain, and more. We use a variety of pain management methods, including modalities, soft tissue mobilization, and therapeutic exercise. If you're in need of physical rehabilitation or physical therapy, get the highest quality health care at Top Rehab. Most insurance is accepted, and we're open Monday, Wednesday, and Friday 8 to 6, Tuesday and Thursday 8 to 5, and Saturday 10 till 2. Call for an appointment today at 313-846-0555. That's 313-846-0555. Choose Top Rehab Physical Therapy Clinic on Michigan Avenue in Dearborn. Life's too short to be in pain. Get ready for an amazing experience at Ishtar Restaurant on 15 Mile Road in Sterling Heights. Enjoy excellent hospitality from owners Ali Al-Baghdadi and Fatty Bonham, serving the best in Mediterranean food. Try Chef Ali Al-Baghdadi's famous shawarma, the best Iraqi grills and food, and the best Arabic and international dishes. Dine in our authentic atmosphere or take out. Call 586-698-2585 or check us out on Facebook. Ishtar Restaurant practices all CDC CDC guidelines and is open every day 11 a.m. to 10 p.m. Have an amazing experience today at Ishtar Restaurant, 3625 15 Mile Road, Sterling Heights.
I am Atif Abdel Jawad. Join me the first Friday of each month at 8 a.m. Eastern Time. I will be discussing some of the most important issues and events in the Middle East live on America's Voice of the Arabs. WNZK 690 AM and WDMV 700 AM.
Welcome back to our discussion on Radio Baladi. We are discussing Mr. Biden's policies in the Middle East. Professor Chirac, will the Biden presidency be a third Obama term?
Of course, there are certain elements of continuity, as we were discussing earlier, in terms of personnel choices. These are, the people that will be at the top of the national security and foreign policy decision-making process in the new, Biden administration are very familiar. People who've worked, in government before and who had senior positions, in the Obama-Biden team. That said, the circumstances are quite different. And at this particular juncture, when Mr. Biden will be inaugurated president, he knows very well, because he can, look at the political landscape, his margins will be very, very narrow. He, of course, he's the president. He's been elected with a comfortable popular vote margin and what have you. However, the Congress will be, really divided, and he will have an extremely small margin in the House of Representatives, where now the Democrats have a diminished majority, and we still don't know how it's going to be in the Senate. But even if the Democrats are really lucky and win both seats that are up for grabs in Georgia, it will still be an extremely narrow majority. And if they don't win majority in the Senate, then that's even worse, which is to say, whatever the aspirations, whatever the grand designs that a Biden administration would want to put forward, it would be extremely difficult to carry them out without some sort of co-optation of at least some Republicans. And that will have to be, therefore a negotiated compromise solution to whatever. I go back to what I was saying before. One area where there seems to be almost total agreement, strangely enough, in Washington, D.C., where people don't agree on anything, Democrats and Republicans don't agree on the time of day, is, I repeat, China. Just today in the Wall Street Journal, the top intelligence official of the outgoing Trump administration, said this is our number one problem, China. And this has been echoed already by pronouncements, although maybe a little softer in tone, by the incoming Secretary of State and others who have said we need to build alliances and convergence on dealing with China. So that's one area where, strangely enough, where there seems to be possibility of a broad consensus in terms of policies. But when it comes down to other parts of the world that are not deemed to be a priority by all parties, then the Biden people will have to compromise. And I don't think that it would be, important for them to take a righteous attitude to say, well, this is our position, and we're not going to negotiate, be that as it may. I don't think so. I don't think Mr. Biden wants to use his political capital, squander it on matters that he and his people do not believe are the highest priorities for the nation.
Ambassador Abington, what about Mr. Biden's policies toward China? Will it be a continuity?
No, but I want to say that I agree very much with what Professor Chirac said, that Biden is going to have a difficult time no matter what happens with the elections in Georgia. The Congress is too evenly divided. The two camps are disagree on too much, but there could be areas where they can cooperate domestically. Hopefully, cooperation on a program to deal with the economic effects of the COVID pandemic. Maybe an infrastructure program. But certainly, I think the one area where there does seem to be some consensus is China, and where Biden will strike a very different tone than Trump is, instead of going it alone and starting trade disputes with almost every serious country in the world, I feel confident that Biden and his team will try to build an international consensus and an international coalition to deal with China on key important issues. And I think that will be much more effective in getting in moderating Chinese or changing Chinese behavior than the scattergun approach that the Trump administration has used.
Ambassador Edward Abington, thank you very much. My thanks also go to Professor De Roche and Professor Von Chirac, and we'll see you the first Friday next month. Have a good weekend.